Welcome to the Nanovation Podcast. Information about this and other episodes can be found at fillerlab.com/nanovation. If you like what you hear, be sure to tell a friend or leave a review at Apple Podcasts. It really does help. I welcome your thoughts and suggestions. You can contact me on Twitter at Michael Filler or via email at nanovationpodcast@gmail.com.
How small can it become? How cheap can you make it? And then it turns out that if we could put it on a fiber and put it inside a battery, that they thought would be very interesting.
That's Patrik Dalqvist, the CEO of the Swedish company Insplorion, explaining how the car company Volvo first became interested in their nanoplasmonic sensor technology. Patrik and Elin Langhammer, one of Insplorion's founders and current technical director, spoke about the company's birth, the science behind their nanoplasmonic sensor technology, their early attempts to achieve product-market fit, and how their technology promises to dramatically improve the performance and lifetime of batteries in electric vehicles. This episode has all the trappings of a Hollywood blockbuster, a fledgling company with an exciting technology that must do battle against the status quo. But through a combination of ingenuity and perseverance, they start to turn the tide. Go ahead, pop some popcorn, sit back, and enjoy the show. This is the Nanovation Podcast, an exploration of big innovations emerging from small things. I'm Mike Filler, your host and a professor at the Georgia Institute of Technology. Enjoy the show. It is my pleasure to welcome Patrik Dalqvist and Elin Langhammer. They are both employees of Insplorion, and they'll describe for you in a second what they do at the company. Insplorion is a company started a couple years ago to commercialize what is known as nanoplasmonic sensing for different applications. Their company works primarily in air quality and in sensing for electric vehicles. So we'll hear more about that in a short while. So Patrik, Elin, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So Insplorion is located in Gothenburg, Sweden. It's the home of Chalmers University, and it's technically, is that on the North Sea?
Yeah, I guess you'd say so. We call it Kattegat outside here, I guess, and Skagerrak.
Yeah.
But it's tied into the Atlantic.
I see. Okay. And Patrik, why don't we have you talk a little bit about how you found your way to Insplorion?
I am a chemical engineer from the very beginning, from Chalmers University. But my last year there, I went at something called the Chalmers School of Entrepreneurship, where I worked with a other sensor company called QSense. And that was when I started to get to know Bengt Cassimo, who is one of the co-founders of QSense. Then I run around in the world. I guess I see myself nowadays as a serial entrepreneur, taking...
I'm sorry.
What happened?
No, I'm just, it's a blessing and a curse, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
But basically after QSense, a few years with QSense, I worked with another technology company called Medfield Diagnostics, developing a stroke radar. But then Bengt contacted me again when... a new project was at School of Entrepreneurship that later became Insplorion. So that is how in the early days with Insplorions, that I got to know Elin.
Great. Okay, so Elin, why don't you explain your route to Insplorion?
Yes, so I'm one of the founders of the company. So I did my PhD with Bengt Cassimo, and developed this technology during my PhD then. And so I've been part of it from the beginning, when we took the project to the Chalmers School of Entrepreneurship, and then eventually started the company in 2010.
Okay. And you are founder and technical director, and then Patrik is CEO, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Correct. So I've turned to the dark side and worked with the finance and economy and commercializing and stuff like that.
Yeah, being a fellow chemical engineer, though, we can say that chemical engineers can do it all. So,
Thank you.
So let's talk about the founding of the company. How long ago was it founded?
So we took the project or presented idea for the Chalmers School of Entrepreneurship in 2008. And then they were developing the project as part of their education for about a year. And in January 2010, we founded the company.
Okay. And it came out of research that was done in Bengt Kasimo's lab?
Yes, it was a joint effort, my PhD thesis and Christoph Langhammer's PhD thesis, so who is nowadays my husband.
Okay.
Yeah, so when I talk about investors, I can present Insplorion as it started with a small family where basically two PhD students, Elin and Christoph, started to develop the project, where the grandfather are Bengt Kasimo and Igor, one of the other early days. And then Elin and Christoph, their first child became Insplorion. Now they have got married and have real children too. but that's in a sense how it came out of birth from Chalmers.
I see. Yeah, I'll have to say real quick that it's such a small world. I was a postdoc at Caltech in 2006 to 2008, and I remember reading then and even into my early years as a faculty member some of the work that was coming out from you all on this sensing stuff. So I remember Nanoletters papers with the Langhammer name on them from about 10 years ago. And it's great. I'm looking forward to hearing about how this has transformed into Insplorion. Okay, so the company starts, and it focuses on nanoplasmonic sensing. And maybe before we talk about what you were trying to do out of the gate, maybe we should talk about nanoplasmonic sensing. So can one of you describe the physics there?
In simple terms, I usually describe it as that we have small nanoparticle antennas that we address with light. So we shine light on the nanoparticles, and when we do that, they will actually start probing their environment to detect what's around them. And then they send back a slightly modified light signal, which then gives us information about what they actually found. So by monitoring the light change induced by these particles, we get information about changes in the material properties around them.
For our extra curious listeners, can you describe what a surface plasmon is in more detail? Not a ton of detail. I don't need any equations, but...
That's good. I don't remember them, I think. But it's collective oscillation of the conduction electrons in a metal nanoparticle, which is called a localized surface plasmon resonance. So what happens is that when you shine light with an appropriate frequency onto the particles, you can induce this collective oscillation in the conduction electrons. It's like a wave phenomena, and you get a resonance oscillation at a certain frequency. And what we do then is to monitor this frequency of the light, which actually causes the resonance oscillation. And if you increase the refractive index around a nanoparticle, you will dampen the plasmon resonance. You will shift the resonance oscillation to a longer or a shorter frequency.
I think I've once heard an explanation that the plasmon, in a sense, is a cousin to photons that only occurs where you have this metal film or metal particle. So it's basically an electromagnetic particle that both can be a particle and a wave. Is that a good, or did somebody joke me on that one?
No, that's a correct explanation. Yes.
Yeah, and we'll forgive you anyway as the CEO. So
exactly, I get away with that.
So I was going to say one of my favorite analogies is a bucket of water. It's very classical in the phenomenon, but imagine a bucket full of water, and the water are the conduction electrons. And so depending on how much water is in the bucket, you will have different resonant frequencies at which the water sloshes back and forth. And if you also have a different size bucket, the water will move differently. And those are the frequencies you're talking about. And then you put this particle, or in our case, this bucket, in these different environments, and those frequencies shift around, which gives you this sensing capability.
Yeah,
it's a good.
Yeah, and in our world, the different frequency is basically a different color of the light that gets back. So we are tracking small changes in color that arise from the different frequencies.
Right, and so then a key benefit of nanoplasmonic sensing is what relative to other sensors?
Is this one for me?
You can start, and I can fill in.
When I decided to work with Insplorion, one of the things that I thought was really cool, and that I think still is really cool, is that in a sense we get a much smarter and miniaturized sensor so that we can make the rest of the device, if we're talking a device, simple and cheap. So thanks to that, we have the nanoparticles, and the way that we work with them, we get a sensitive, small and robust sensor that allows us to go into areas where other sensing technologies cannot go. As I mentioned, I previously worked with a company called QSense, where we were working with a technology that we also thought could go broad into medical devices and so on. But it stayed a research instrument because it's sensitive to temperature and strain and so on. Now we have a robust yet sensitive technology that can become cost effective, where due to that we have smartness built into the actual technology that I think is really neat.
So how about the sensitivity? Because if you look at the papers, and I'm sure you wrote these papers, Elin, it always is that nanoplasmonic sensing is really sensitive in terms of small changes in the environment. Do you all take advantage of that?
Yes, that's what we use in our research instruments and other applications. It's true that it's very sensitive to changes occurring close to the surface, but the changes occurring further away, we don't detect that well. So this means that it's surface discriminative. So it's if you have a bulk change, we won't see that, which can be also an advantage in many applications, because the signal is not poisoned by other things occurring in the bulk of the sample.
Right. That's a great point. So how do you, let's assume we have great sensitivity and it's a robust platform. How do you get specificity?
That we do by functionalizing the surfaces in different ways. When talking about detecting, if you talk about biomolecules, then you would bind some kind of biological entity to the surface, which provides you with a specificity. When talking about gas sensors, it's coating the sensor with some material that specifically interacts with the gas you're interested in.
Right. All right. So you can basically attach anything you want that interacts with something you're interested in, and then you get the specificity that way.
Yes, exactly. And you might also need to coat the surface with something that excludes other stuff, for example.
Also, another good point. This is all the engineering that you have to do to make a viable product versus publish a paper in nanoletters, yes. Right?
Exactly. So that's really where we, as a company, takes the next step, basically coming from research, but where we start to, especially with the air quality project when it comes to gas sensing, in collaboration with Chalmers, have developed the surface, but where the company then do the miniaturization and prototyping of devices and ensure that we have relevant testing for it, so that it actually becomes a good NOx sensing device.
That's a great segue. So let's talk about what you thought you were going to do right out of the gate. So it's 2008 or 2010, around that time frame. What was the focus? What kind of sensors were you trying to commercialize?
Although we could see that the technology had applications both as in research instruments as in more larger scale sensor applications, we decided actually in the beginning to go for the research instrument business. And what we actually brought to the Chalmers School of Entrepreneurship was not exactly the technology that then came to be the basis of Insplorion. It was somewhat related for detecting hydrogen using nanoplasmonics as well.
That was back in the time when it was a hydrogen boom. Everybody were talking about solar cells, and a lot of research money was going into that. So that made sense then. But then research money started to not go into hydrogen cells and
fuel cells
and so on. So that didn't work out.
Yeah. I feel like that's the most common theme is it never works out in the beginning, but people are successful if they try something different and keep at it. So sorry, Elin, you were going to say?
Yeah, so we did, during the first year or so, we discovered this technology that we call the nanoplasmonic sensing that was the basis then for Insplorion. So in the beginning, we tried to commercialize this for catalytic applications, research instruments for studying catalytic reactions. And today, I think we have sold 2 instruments to that field. So it was not very easy, both because the technology was maybe not developed enough for that kind of applications, but also because it's a very conservative field.
Yeah, and I feel like they also have these other techniques where they're okay with a mass spec or an FTIR or something in a catalytic reactor. The demands of that kind of space is not quite the same as
the problem is that they are not okay with it, but they don't understand it.
Okay.
No, we were trying to. Our instrument would kind of bridge the gap between UHV science and looking at the real monolith catalyst and so on. So we were kind of on the border between these two, or in the middle of them. And not very many people actually work there. So it was hard to convince them to go there, even though it would be a lucrative field, I think, where you need a lot of more research. But since there hasn't been any instruments that can help you with that, not so many researchers are used to doing that, and getting them to understand and moving into that field was difficult.
Yeah, I guess old habits die hard.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
So if someone came to you today and said, "I want to buy one of these for a catalytic sensing application," would you still sell it, or have you gone on to all bigger and more commercial things?
On the instrument side, we have continued and where we basically use the same platform, the same electronics units. It's similar in the way, but instead of only having a measurement chamber that is good for high temperature and good gas control, which is where we started for the catalytic application, we also have a measurement chamber for liquid application for the researchers that had interest in looking at protein on surfaces and lipid bilayers and much more life science type of applications. And then we started to pick up more sales.
Okay.
And then we, about 2 years ago, we also launched a combo module that can tie into another research instrument called quartz crystal microbalance, where we could target a specific customer group, and that now we start to sell a few instruments a year instead of one every second year. So it's now it's a business that stands by itself and give a bit of contribution to our development projects, but we're still not getting very rich and famous for it. But it's a good it starts to be a good business now. The more that we find users that where it actually fits and helps, and the more that we've learned, the better it has become, basically.
Yeah, I think characterization tools in general, unfortunately, are not given the credit they're due, and we often give credit to people who've used them to understand a phenomenon or advance a technology, when that understanding or that technological advance would have never come without the tool. So, but that's just the way the world works. So,
thank you, Mike. I like you even more now.
Well, yeah, we're both chemical engineers. Okay, yeah, this is going well. So now let's talk a bit about the sensing for automotive and air quality. So you said in your email to me that Gothenburg is Volvo country. So with that, why don't you talk a bit about sensing in the automotive space?
Yeah. I think that's a good story that kind of describes how we evolve as a company. But basically, already from the beginning, even though we chose to start and focus on selling what we had, which basically was a research instrument, we also from the beginning always had the feeling that the true potential with this technology is to develop it as a device and scale it up in volume and find specific applications where you had the need for sensing and a device that could cost only a few dollars but could be sold in millions of units. So we back then we had a science paper from Elin that was focusing on the catalytic process with NOx. So we basically went to Volvo and asked, "Isn't it time for you to upgrade your NOx sensors so that you can have a better optimization of your combustion engines and so on?" And what we've seen with the Dieselgate and Volkswagen and so on, there is a need for this type of sensors too.
Yeah.
But back then. It was this type of meeting that really never took off, and we felt that we're not getting anywhere here. And then they basically gave the feedback that, yeah, it's interesting, but you need to invest this much to take it to the market, and it's not mature, and so on and so forth. But then we started to shift the dialogue a bit, and they basically started to ask questions about, how small can it become? How cheap can you make it? And then it turns out that if we could put it on a fiber and put it inside a battery, that they thought would be very interesting. Due to that, they came from the battery optimization group, a few of these people, and they basically wanted to have work with their batteries in a much more efficient way. They basically told us that they had hit the ceiling with developing algorithms and developing the battery management system and increasing the use of batteries. But if the sensor could sit inside a battery to provide information from the chemistry, which basically is the limitation factors for a battery system, that would be very valuable. So that was the starting meeting for what now is our battery sensor project.
So you can read about this on the Insplorion website, so I'll put a link in the show notes about the battery work. But you more or less describe how much of batteries in current EV cars are wasted because we have bad sensing and control systems. Can you talk about how we determine battery charge and health today and what an Insplorion sensor can do to improve that?
Yes, so today the current technology that is used is voltammetric readout. So you measure the voltage, current, and also the temperature at some selected spots. Maybe in a battery pack with like 30 cells, you may measure the temperature in 3 places or so not in every cell. These measurements are okay if you calibrate your system frequently, but that can be a problem because you need to then have the battery at full charge and at rest to be able to calibrate it. And if you don't do that, you can have a lot of drift in the signal, meaning that you go outside of the fixed voltage boundaries that you put on battery usage. And if you go outside of those limits, the battery will degrade quickly. We sometimes describe it as if you're trying to measure the voltage of a battery cells, it's actually dependent on the load, so if the battery is used or not. So this is a disturbance, somewhat similar to if you were to weigh yourself and someone was jumping on the balance next to you. It's a bit of the same problem that you're facing today with trying to determine the actual status of the battery using just these external measurements technologies. So what our sensor would provide is a completely new way actually of diagnosing batteries by going inside the battery cell and measuring on the chemistry where the relevant reactions take place. So you can then get a direct measure of the battery charge, for example.
So you say on the website, I'll just read, I think I just copied this text here, but measuring battery status inside lithium-ion cells with the help of our battery sensor can result in up to 50% increase in available energy. That's amazing.
Yeah.
That's how bad the other measurement technology is. So the same battery, just being able to sense it more accurately gives you potentially a 50% increase in available energy to use.
Yeah, this is an example from a publication where they basically look at how much safety margins are put on batteries just to be able to ensure that you don't hurt and decrease the lifespan. So, and especially for some chemistries for heavy vehicles, it is very hard to measure and get a good estimation of state of health when you get closer to full and fully discharged. So you have these type of measurements where you, in a sense, you go up to 75-80%, and then you go down to 15-20%. But by increasing that limit just by measuring so that you don't need these big limits, you can actually gain a lot. But then it's different from chemistry to chemistry, so we might not do as much on all chemistries, but all applications you need this way of getting much more input to the battery management system, since voltammetric measurements does not tell anything about the chemistry, and the chemistry is what sets the limits for how much you can get out of the battery, basically.
Right. And so you have this picture of how this works at a very high level, where you have this sensor probe that's inserted into a battery cell. And can you, without having to come track everyone down who listens to the podcast, because you didn't want to tell them about how it works, can you tell us how it works?
We can tell you in general terms.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Yeah.
It's based on the nanoplasmonic sensing technology, where we actually put our nanostructure on an optical fiber that is then inserted into the battery cell. And as we talked about earlier, this technology is sensitive to changes in the materials around the nanoparticles, and we then detect changes occurring inside the battery. It can be either in the electrode materials or in the electrolyte, and this is then correlated with the battery status,
so
the state of charge.
Right. So instead of putting these little particles on a surface, let's say they're still on a surface, I guess, but the surface of a fiber, the light comes in, you're still doing light in, the light out is modulated by the changes in the environment, and then you detect that. But it's very integrated in the sense you're right in the battery, sensing directly what's going on.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, and it's early on we got these questions from the industry. Are you sure that you don't mess up with the battery, that you have the same performance, and are you sure that you can seal the battery and so on? So that we quite early were able to develop and try out with a small battery company, so that we have made small series of commercially made batteries. But now lately we just also got funded a project where we are using one of other of these neat features with the technology, where we basically can coat part of the sensor so that some of the nanoparticles will not be affected by lithium ion concentration. And then it will basically be a temperature sensor instead. So that we, with the same probe that is small enough so that it doesn't affect the battery, still measure changes in both the lithium ion concentration as well as temperature. And these are high value input when optimizing the whole battery system to be able to get as much out of the battery without harming it, basically. So it's quite nice that we just are starting that project too, with using it as a temperature sensor in combination with lithium ion, which might not be on the homepage. That's why I need to say it.
I see. And the temperature sensing is done with plasmonics too, or is that a more traditional approach?
No, it's exactly. It's using the same type of nanoparticles, but we can use a different size so that we basically have two elements that we can distinguish when we track the color. But then then we are embedding these other nanoparticles, these bigger sized nanoparticles, so that they so that we get a thickness that builds more than the detection of the nanoparticles. Basically, if we get a coating that is in the range of 100 nanometers or so on, then they will only be sensitive to temperature and not the chemical concentrations changes, since it's not close to them. So then we use the same nanoparticles, but we have designed the coating around them so that it becomes a temperature sensor sitting inside the battery instead.
So the physics is though very similar to what we talked about earlier, where temperature leads to changes in the permittivity of the surrounding material that then you pick up in the plasmon.
Exactly. Same physics, same sensing platform, but instead of exposing the nanoparticles to lithium ion concentration changes, they are only exposed to temperature changes, and then it's a temperature sensor instead.
Yeah, very cool. I'm curious about the light in and light out part of this. There's a lot of people in my community who are trying to do electronic let's say biosensing, get rid of the light altogether. It turns out to be pretty hard to do that well. But in terms of your technology, where does the light come from, and how do you detect it, and how do you make it compact and cheap enough?
We use usually a white or a broadband light source. and then a detector which is to some extent separated on detecting, or has some pixels that detect light at different wavelengths. And you can find these components fairly cheap, actually.
Okay. So in a sense, it's a very cheap LED light or small LED light component, and then similar type of detector that you also can get on a small circuit board, and all for even with small volumes, a few dollars.
Wow.
And then it's basically you need to have a fiber that is split so that you basically can send in and get out light from the same fiber.
Right. Yeah, I think a lot about, I think of this company, Ocean Optics. You familiar with them?
Yes.
Very.
Okay. For those who don't know, they were one of the pioneers in this space of ultra compact spectrometry, where you would have like a USB stick, and it would have the spectrometer on the little USB stick, and you'd couple it, connect it to a fiber, and be able to detect something using, doing UV vis, basically. I didn't realize that you could get the components for as cheap as you're saying, so that's great. Okay. And I guess in a car, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, in a sense, since we have the nanoparticles enhancing the signal, we don't need a spectrometer on that side. We have a spectrometer in our research instrument, but basically in the final device, when working with the battery sensor, any detector that just look at changes in light intensity as a specific wavelength is enough, and there you can have really cheap components.
Got it. So are these in any cars that are driving on the street yet?
We are heading there, but the next project where we put it in a live application, we just started, and we are starting with energy storage, batteries for energy storage, where there is a need also for basically the more wind and solar power that we get, we need more energy storage. But so far, batteries are not as cost effective and efficient in that way. But within this project, we are using our sensor to be able to monitor both state of charge and health, and in that way optimize the performance of the battery, so that you basically can get better economy when running battery energy storage solution. So that we are starting now, and we're building this spring, and hope to have some nice real applications data on the next summer, or during next year, about summertime.
Great. There's one other thing I should mention, because I think it's a great point, that when you have much more accurate readings of battery health, there's this potential to have a commercial secondary market emerge, because you just know more about the batteries you're going to be selling after they've been used.
Exactly. That's we think that's one of the great advantages, actually, with using our sensor, to get a second life for aftermarket working. Today it's not really working because of the lack of information. You're not able to tell what each battery and battery cell has been exposed to and what they have encountered during their lifetime, and that makes it hard to determine exactly what their state is and their health is. So you cannot really determine a price for it and also a suitable application. So by getting this information, you will make the Second Life market work much better.
Right. Another question I had was related to other kinds of products with lithium-ion batteries. So a lot of people listening are probably thinking, well, I'm listening to this on my computer or cell phone, or personal computer in my pocket, and wondering, well, it'd be great if I could get 30% more time on a charge. Is there potential for your technology to go into those kinds of products as well?
Yeah, when we feel visionary, we definitely are heading in that direction. But it's both that we need to miniaturize yet one or two more steps, especially when looking for the cell phone. It's very size is a limit, and even though we have small components in our device when it comes to the LED light and so on, it still needs to be very small. But laptops, why not down the road? It definitely, and it has the same need. I think most of us has experienced how the cell phone can go from 25% to zero with nothing really happening, and it's for the same reasons why better diagnostic tools are needed. So we definitely see the need for it, but it's let's do energy storage and automotive first, and then we miniaturize to laptops and cell phones.
Yeah, and obviously it's a plenty huge market on its own.
We have stuff to do, even when we segment the market in this way.
We have stuff to do. That is the understatement of the year. So there's also work you're doing in air quality measurements. How'd that come about, and what are you doing there? It's
basically a lot of the good data that we heard early on was on NOx sensing. That's what we took to Volvo early on, and we had some traction, and I guess we got a bit of fame for these type of results. So we got approached by entrepreneurs that basically had been looking for good NOx sensors, but for air quality, not only to look in and optimize a combustion engine. So market basically came to us after that they had this company had scanned what was available and had no good sensing technology. So we started to look into that and saw that, this is probably a good fit for where our technology fits in, that it's need for high sensitivity, but also need to become cost effective. So then we pursued that project and were able to get a bit of soft funding from the Swedish government, so that we, in a collaboration with Chalmers, the Christoph Langhammer part, could have a postdoc and develop this specificity and selectivity that we discussed early on. So basically, so that we could optimize the chemical layer on top of our sensor. And while we as a company worked more on the miniaturization part. And that it's a fun project. We feel happy with the results that are coming out, and we are now taking it outdoor to work in a collaboration with the Gothenburg city and getting these out in the streets to monitor air quality on a much more ground level and on many more sites that are today done with the expensive equipment that often sits at rooftops and might not be as relevant as and not tell that much about the air that we actually breathe.
Right. Can you imagine having these low-cost sensors be multiplexed? Right. It seems like NOx is one thing, but there are other air pollutants you'd like to measure with the low cost and high spatial resolution that you're talking about. Do you see opportunities there?
Yes, that's actually one of the great advantages that I think we maybe touched upon earlier as well with the technology, that you don't need a very large area of nanoparticles to actually detect the signal. So you can make a small sensor having many different areas where you detect different gases. So this is something that's in our pipeline for to make it more and more gases.
So it's something that we are doing in both our development projects now. With the battery sensor, we're both doing a chemical sensor for lithium ion and multiplexing it with temperature. But and down the road with air quality, we're building the platform to also look at, I think we do it in the steps, carbon monoxide, ozone, and lastly sulfur oxide, because it's so contaminant, so we don't want to do that too early.
Right. I think this space is fascinating. I mean, my group works a little bit in this area of scaling nanotechnology, and this is one of those examples of that, where if you could do it cheaply and really cheaply, you can put them everywhere, and that fundamentally changes how you do something. It's not whiz-bang new scientific breakthrough, although plasmons have had their day in the sun too, but these kinds of things change the world and change how we operate as humans. And so it's just very exciting to see someone deploying this kind of thing in that way. So that's great. I'm excited to hear about it.
Yeah, no, and that is, I think, also what we are excited about, and also the timing for this is now. The whole Internet of Thing is happening now. It wasn't happening 10 years ago, so this would not at all be as relevant 10 years ago. But with the possibilities that you can get small devices connected and get a map of air quality if you just have a good sensor outside that is cheap enough. We have both good timing and are in a area where you have an increased awareness about the air quality, and so it really picks into place where this technology can help many people to make much more sound decisions of how to go about to get better air quality around themselves.
Right, and of course, those ideas can be extended to most everything that you can now detect with higher spatial resolution and lower cost. So in closing, I want to ask you both one question, and one of my role models, sadly passed away recently, is Andy Grove from Intel. So Andy was the CEO of Intel for a long time, and he's famous for this quote that only the paranoid survive. And I'm curious what it is that makes you all paranoid. There's a better way to say that. It's like, what keeps you up at night? What are you nervous about as you develop this technology?
What am I nervous about? Lately, I've been working with financing, and that's always, I think that's quite general for all startup companies, to ensure that you have good interest among your shareholders and can ensure that you have funding for the next development step and so on. But but we have good dialogues, and I really don't need to be that nervous, but I'm always nervous about that, I guess.
Right. I guess that's the blessing and the curse comment from earlier.
Yeah, exactly.
Elin, did you have any thoughts on that?
I think as we also talked a little bit about with the catalysis application, it's always difficult to reach out with a new product, and getting through to the right people when discussing with larger companies and getting them interested and getting this into the system. So they will have to change a little bit how they work, and convincing them that they should do it, and getting to talk to the right people which are actually interested in developing something new.
Yeah, that's hard. I think most people listening to this are thinking, yeah, that's really It's really hard, no matter what you're working on. So, well, Patrik Dalqvist and Elin Langhammer, it's been a real pleasure. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having us.
You've been listening to Nanovation. If you enjoyed the show, please leave a rating or write a review on Apple Podcasts. Show notes are available at fillerlab.com/nanovation. Nanovation is recorded in the Marcus Nanotechnology Building on the campus of Georgia Tech. Andrew Cannon edits the show. I'm Mike Filler. See you next time.